Hello, welcome to the second part of the lecture. So in the first part of the lecture, we have looked at the specific case of rural women farmers in South Asia. There are a lot of studies focusing on gender differences and gender disadvantages that could contribute to poverty faced by certain gender groups, usually women. So I have tried to summarize all these different studies in this one slide. So this slide is going to take a long time, I think, to try to expose you to all the studies that have been done about gender and poverty, right? So the first one here is gender divisions of labor. The common gender problem that we discuss, especially in terms of economics, is how women are um, doing unpaid and undervalued work usually. For example, caring for the family, cooking, and this includes subsistence agriculture, right? Especially in the context of meal out migration. So women have been doing not only the household work, but also in rural settings, things like grazing the goats, grazing animals, cutting firewood, cutting fodders, looking after their home gardens and their own agricultural field. Unequal valuing of different kinds of labor did not exist from the beginning. This is kind of created after the process of commercializations or after the introduction of market and cash economy. Because imagine before the penetration of a market and cash economy, both the men and women are really doing subsistence reproductions of the family. So both men and women needs to work in the field, needs to grow their own food, and then do other kind of activities to ensure the survival of the family. You could say that in some parts of the world, maybe the women always work more than the men because they are deemed to have bigger responsibilities in terms of caring and cooking and domestic chores. But nonetheless, the value of their work is not that much of a difference. So feminist Marxists like Leacock and Mehta here, they talk about how the clear undervaluing of women's labor really only come after the introduction of wage employments and cash economy, because men tend to take up um, wage employment. So men participating in cash economy usually more than women, and as a result, men become more value for the economic power because of the cash they brought in. And women, on the other hand, are having more and more burden in terms of the agricultural chores or the subsistence reproduction work that they need to take over from men. At the same time, they were undervalued for doing more work. So women actually have a lot of knowledge in the domestic fields and agricultural fields, but then this knowledge were never championed as important. And it is always the men who get the training and get introduced into technology because they were considered people responsible for the economic well-being of the household. So this is linked to the second point I have here in the slides, which is colonial and development policies that left out women. So from the very beginning, in the colonial era, when the colonial officers are trying to develop crop for exports in the colonies, they have always been targeting men in giving training because somehow the European or the Western women were not traditionally identified as workers or producers in the agricultural field. This has been continued by a lot of development policies. So Kimberly, for instance, wrote about how the initial women development programs was focusing on home economics, meaning how to ensure hygienic practices and good nutrition of a household. And those kind of trainings were being pushed to women in India. But Kimberly was arguing that during that time, women actually played a very important role in producing for food in the agricultural field. But this is totally ignored by the development policies. And many of these development policies try to bring in new technologies, new training, and they were mostly focusing on men in terms of farming. And as a result, women have always stick to the traditional way of doing things. So when they go for farming, they are the one who do the rice planting, and the men are the ones who operate like tillers machines to till the ground. Even in current days, you can see this gender division of labor, how men, if they collect revenues from the forest, they would use sawmills to cut down timbers and sell them to the timber companies. And then the women would go and collect forest products, including medicinal plants and some kinds of edible foods. So this gender division of labor persists as a result of course, pre-existing social norms, but also decades of development and colonial policies. Bosirab, actually, she's a very sort of the first person who really draw international attention about women's in development. So she was saying that modernization has actually ignored the different roles women play in different parts of the world, and as a result, exacerbate gender inequalities in some parts of the world, especially in parts where women are heavily responsible in feeding their children through subsistence agriculture. They were being left out by all these development policies that tend to focus on men. The third point here is something that we have talked about a lot in the last part of the lecture, which is unrecognized land property and associated rights of women. So if you don't have land titles, especially in modern economy and modern government administration approach, you do not have access to different kinds of rights and amenities, insurance, irrigation services, and other things that only come with those rights, with those land titles. And then, so Agarwal actually is a very vehement sort of scholar activist who have often advocated for India, especially to recognize and promote land titles of women rather than promote employment, because she believed that land titles is the single most empowering elements that women need. And then alcoholism and domestic abuse. This actually can be observed quite widely in the world. Some women face domestic abuse by their husbands, and sometimes the husband's family too. And then also gender ideology. So, for example, high caste Hindu women or Muslim in some parts of the world, not all parts of the world though, in some parts of the world have a strict seclusion norm, which they call purda. So women are not supposed to work outside or expose themselves in public setting. So if you understand development as freedom and poverty as deprivation of that freedom, so then women is deprived of moving around freely in some parts of the world. And also there are some gender ideologies of marrying daughters early, so that they can retain honor of their families, just to ensure the women marry appropriate partners and not having illegible affairs before their time. So, and early marriages will also restrict women's choices in life, because they are required to transfer to an entirely different family and might not be able to continue schooling or even working as they wish. And also, dowry is an institutions in also some parts of the world. The bride's family have to pay a significant amount to the groom's family when during marriage. So this has resulted in less favor of daughters compared to sons, and which has a direct impact on girls' education, because, for example, I have a Nepali girlfriend who told me that in the place she came from, which is located in Terai, Nepal, if she gets a good education, they must look for a groom who are compatible or even have high qualifications than the brides, and that means a fixed rate of dowry, which is usually very expensive. So families are not incentivized to send girls for schooling, and also girls just usually are very good domestic helpers compared to sons. Some scholars also talk about the different social expectations of daughters and daughters-in-laws compared to sons and sons-in-law. So, for example, Mills, in her study in Thailand, she was talking about how a lot of Thai young women migrate from rural areas to urban areas, and they were expected to support their kids and their family much more than what would be expected of sons. And so, as a result, daughters have much more burden than sons. And then also Bennett talk about in her fascinating book called Dangerous Wife, Sacred Sister. If you are interested in gender issues in South Asia, you should definitely check out Bennett's book. And she was talking about how in a Hindu family in South Asia, the daughter-in-laws are usually deemed as outsiders of the family. So they are usually not trusted, and they are usually heavily supervised and controlled to ensure they don't pose a threat to the husband family. So what does this mean from an individual's perspective, right? So it means that if you're a girl, you'll probably think about all these things. If I go to school, nobody is helping the household chores. Um, if I go to school, I risk sexual assaults by teachers, right? If I go to school, I might not find a job in the future because of the predominating gender ideologies, or find a job that is not as well paid. If I go to school, my parents need to spend more on my dowry. I might get married soon and will not be allowed to go to school after. I cannot go to school during menstruation days because it is embarrassing, especially if you don't have the appropriate menstrual products or even just the functioning toilets with water in the school. So I put up a picture of Malala, an iconic figure of activists fighting for females' education. She's also the youngest Nobel Prize winner ever known. And then this is showing how GDP per capita is correlating with global gender gap. Well, you can see that that is really not that much of a correlation, right? So you have the rich country over here, um, but they rank quite differently in terms of gender equality. So you have Switzerland that ranks the best compared to Saudi Arabia and UAE, which is a little bit behind, even though they are having similar kind of income. And then you can look at the lower sphere here. You also have countries that do extremely well in terms of gender equality and not very well. So you have Philippines and Rwanda. Look at Rwanda. Rwanda is the one with the lowest GDP and the highest gender equality, better than Switzerland. So you have Rwanda and Philippines here, and then Pakistan and Chad here. And then this is kind of show you some of the positive picture of the historical gender equality index from 1950s to 2000. So you can see that for most part of the world, there has been a steady rise, if incremental, in terms of gender equality. But then if you look at Eastern Europe, that is a sharp fall in the 1980 and 1990. I do not know the specific reason, but the context of the world during that time is the debt crisis and economic recessions, and the impositions of neoliberal structural adjustments on many countries. What are the development responses in the field of international development? I mean, there must be some kind of awareness for them to collect this data in the first place, right? So if you remember, I talked about Bosserab's work a little bit before this, and she's really the pioneer scholar or researcher who talk about women's in development. So there are three different eras of how women's or should be considered in the field of international development. and it's called the wet get. Well, it's kind of catchy. So the first era is WED, which is Women in Development. So the focus during this time um, by all different development agencies is how to include women in development. Because if you remember, I was talking about how many of the colonial and development policies actually excluded women from accessing certain kinds of technologies, farming, and policy benefits because it was assumed that the man was responsible for the household income. So, Women in Development was an initiative across development agencies. I believe it was also started by USAID to include women in development. And then we have Women and Development, kind of pays attention to how women are negatively affected by development processes itself. So it's not just about including women in development processes, but also be more conscious and aware of how development processes are creating more gender inequalities that negatively impact women. And then the most recent discussion or paradigm that we have is gender and development, following a realization that we cannot just talk about women if we want to address gender inequality. We actually have to talk about the relationship between men and women. So, involving men more explicitly in development policies to address this relationship in order to empower women. And then you can see that there are also a lot of global indicators. They are being used to keep track of how countries are doing in terms of gender equality. So one of the most famous one is by Undp, Gender Inequality Index, which actually are being used to also rank Human Development Index, which is a yearly reporting of development status by countries across the world. So this is to show you what GII, Gender Inequality Index, actually measure. It measures health, which is kind of unique to women's, like maternal mortality ratio and adolescent birth rate. Um, and also it compares empowerment of different gender by looking at female and male populations with at least secondary educations, and then female and male shares of parliamentary seats, and also female and male labor force participation rates. And of course, we have a very explicit goal addressing gender equality in the SDG, which is Goal 5. So my question is, there seems to be explicit Sustainable Development Goals on gender inequality, Goal 5, but not other specific kinds of inequality. Goal 10 on reducing inequalities seems to focus on economic inequalities. In your opinion or speculation, why is that?